Hi, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Forest Space. Thanks for joining us for today's event, Wild Kin, a Queer Ecologies Symposium. Begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Chichage, Montreal, and we respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future, and our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Here at Forest Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge, co-creating daily activities that examine research questions and projects happening across the university. And we're running today's event as a live stream, both to YouTube and to Zoom. So if you're joining us on Zoom and you have any comments or questions a little bit later on, that would be really great. Just pop those into the chat. We'll do our best to read those out. Same for here in the space. If you have comments or questions, just raise your hand and we'll run a microphone over to you so that we can hear. Okay, with that, it's very much my pleasure to pass the microphone over to Associate Professor in Fibers and Material Practices, the Studio Arts, Aaron McIntosh. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Doug. I appreciate that intro. I have a lot of different remarks to make, so I'm going to keep this mostly brief, but in general, welcome everybody, bienvenue. We're so glad to have a nice little full house here today. The idea for this conference, this gathering of queer ecological thinkers and radical botanical nerds, was something that I dreamed up in the summer of 2024, over a year ago when I was in the completion stages of the Hothouse Maison Chaude project, which is an exhibition here at Concordia's FOFA Gallery. And to do research capacity building in relation to that project, I helped start a research working group that's a part of CISC, the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Society and Culture at Concordia, and our group is called Queering Nature Studies. We have, over these past 3 semesters, had reading discussions, films, and conversations, really rich conversations, and they have helped shape the lineup of speakers here today, and the first panel are actually 3 members of the research working group. So in their 2010 anthology, Queer Ecology, Sex, Nature, Politics, Desire, Kate Sandilands and Bruce Erickson made the case for an extension of queer into ecology, and not simply being a question of making nature more welcome to gay inhabitation, is also an invitation to open queer theory to ecological possibilities and thus produce a queering of eco-cultural relations. Today's panels bring together writers, artists, and scientists whose works broaden the possibility of such ecocultural relations to queerness and beyond. As we enter a new global era of anti-trans, homophobic, and gender-obsessed legislation, can ecology-centered pedagogies and more than human kinship, mutualism, can these ideas provide alternative liberatory paths forward? These questions, and even thornier ones, tie together our invited speakers today. We're glad you have joined us for these dialogues. There are many people, programs and centers at Concordia who've worked hard to make this possible. Nicole Burrish and Gwen Fulton, big thanks to the 2 successive directors of the FOFA Gallery who spent many generous hours working with me on grant applications to support this gathering. Michelle Pavlovsky, an MFA student who has been helping coordinate all the logistics over the past 3 months and different aspects of the symposium details. And her internship was supported by a Fonds de Recherche Québec internship. The FOFA Gallery staff, especially Maria Andreana Escalona de Apro and Purina Corzo Valero, who helped extensively with communications, promotions, social media leading up to today's event. Misha Solomon, who's the assistant to the research working group, along with Morris Fox, who we're going to hear from shortly, were also very instrumental in doing a lot of the initial promotions for the event. And in addition to funding from CISC, this symposium has received support from the Dean's Office of the Materiality Cluster of the Milieu Center. Big shout out to Kelly Jasvac for helping make that funding pocket come together, and in-kind support here today from Fourth Space. And lastly, the Sustainability Across the Arts initiative of the FOFA Gallery has also really helped support bring our out-of-town speakers here today. So big thank you to all of those funding bodies. Thank you. And I'm also going to, our first panel features 3 Concordia graduate researchers, and we are going to do these talks back to back. So I'm going to read these bios, brief bios, for Morris Fox, Haley Guzik, and Abby Hodson. Morris Fox is a queer settler Canadian artist and poet who is also a PhD candidate in the Interdisciplinary Humanities program at Concordia. His creative research explores queer and ecological grief, cruising sites, and the necro-inflected side of camp political aesthetics, or queer gothic sensibility, through craft, virtual reality, and poetry. He chaired a panel on queer grievance at the 2024 Universities Art Association of Canada, or UAC, conference, and his forthcoming chapter in Home and Craft from Bloomsbury Editions explores early modern queer floriography. His artistic research has been featured in many exhibitions in the US and Canada, and also in the publications Esse and TBA Journal. Fox is a founding member of the queer arts collective Queer Soft Orange. Haley Guzik is an interdisciplinary artist whose work explores the entanglements between cultural systems, environmental crises, and queer feminist technologies. Working across painting, new media, and immersive audiovisual installation, their practice investigates the possibilities of plant-human interaction and speculative world building as a form of ecological care. Their work has been presented at institutions across Canada, including Fondry Darling, Confederation Centre Art Gallery, and MUTEC, with support from Arts New Brunswick, the Canada Council for the Arts, and CALC. Their SSHRC-supported MFA research extends their interest in scientific ecologies through a queer feminist lens. And finally, Abby Hodson is a transdisciplinary artist based between Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, and Kiptut, Halifax. Thank you, Abby. Rooted in collage, video, movement, and textiles, their practice explores the relational nature of bodies, intimate, collective, and more than human. Hodson's ongoing research in creaturing the body involves transforming human limbs through costume, sculpture, and site-responsive video, inviting new, wild forms of kinship between beings, materials, and lands we inhabit. Guided by sensation, play, and eerie delight, they create participatory spaces for collaboration and community building, often through zine making and relational workshops. They are pursuing an MFA in fibers and material practices. Welcome everyone again, and thank you very much for our first panel. So without further ado, Morris.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So pansies, a brief history. Let's just get into it. So I want to look at pansy's cultural resume across its brief 200-year history, its emergence as a slur and a cultural icon, as a pansy patch of backwards thoughts and necropastoral twists, stitching pansiness to tenacious weeds and grave matters in both my creative practice as grave matters. Against the sinister interest of administrators more sinister than ministers, and a sharp uptake of xeno, homo, and transphobic violence, building livable queer worlds becomes an SOS most urgently. This brief history of the pansy also invokes its haunting. Where the hell did I go? Sorry. Okay. So, the historical pansy. The pansy's brief history begins as a wildflower weed popularized by Shakespeare's Hamlet's Ophelia, pansy for your thoughts, also called heart's ease that eventually signified memories to help lovers heartbreak. The hybridization of violets is credited to Lady Mary Bennet with gardener William Richard in 1813, and James Lord Gambier with gardener William Thompson, according to Country Gentleman's Magazine in July 1871. However, William Thompson's 1930s development of the pansy's eye happened by chance. I was struck by seeing what appeared to me a miniature cat's face steadfastly gazing at me, self-sown and left to waste its beauty far from mortal eyes. These pansies were soon popularized with gardening enthusiasts, producing hundreds of varieties. While not linked causally, I sit side by side with this. James Pratt and John Smith were the last men convicted on charges of sodomy and killed by judicial murder in London on November 27, 1835. Their accusers claimed that by peeping through the keyhole, they caught the men in the act, becoming peeping toms, a catchword for the pansies. Floriography, a lover's code of flowers, blooms alongside the rise of homosexual cultures in the 1880s and their suppression after the 1895 Oscar Wilde trial. Within the sentimental language, flowers such as pansy, meadowsweet, carnation, and lily are queerly coded in a heteroromantic language that just won't shut the fuck up. Marc-André Rafalowitsch, poet, salon host, floral arranger, adapted these codes to gesture towards same-sex desire within his poetry, fusing the scent of flowers that are male lovers with floriography. His homosexual identity, affective and ghostly. He infuses a love that has no name into a lexicon dwelling in an unsettling Victorian romance. In Rose's Leaves When the Rose is Dead, he grasped queer desire to a floral bouquet, both love letter and elegy. Lilies for all men to see, heart's ease when men set us apart, sad hyacinth upon thy heart, and poppies, poppies should we kiss, and poppies when we die. So, Don't Be a Pansy emerges in the 1930s, targeting effeminacy and policing masculinity. However, I want to consider the pansy alongside a flowering within Black queer nightlife and the Harlem Renaissance. As Claude McKay writes, the pansies stared and tightened their grips on the dandies, and the dandies tightened their grips on themselves. The labor of queer performers negotiating visibility and threat is a pansy poetics of a memorial and a drag performance of exuberant work. Much like building queer worlds in hostile environments, pansies tighten their grip and proliferate. Pansy culture is indebted to queer Black culture that proliferated in the face of racism, homophobia, and state-sanctioned violence. Queer Black performers such as Gladys Bentley and Jeannie Harlow performed at queer haunts like the Clam House and Hamilton Lodge, helped seed pansy and dandy culture in our popular culture, influencing the pansy craze of the interwar period and is the roots of our queer culture now. The single 1926 issue of Fire explored interracial relationships, homosexuality, color prejudice, and more, is where County Cullen published his sonnet From the Dark Tower. In the dark we hide the hearts that bleeds, and wait and tend our agonizing seeds. So let's think about the two meanings of the word standard, an index and also a flag. Pansy purple enters English at the same time as its flower hybrid, placed between indigo and violet in the Dictionary of Color, which index not only the color names, but the sensations on which the names are bestowed. The British Colour Council produced its own color standard, but conflicting academic definitions, unreliable adherence, and various errors created indexical chaos. 1928's Clothier and Furniture Trade magazine warned men against wearing pansy, describing this color as not only unfit for men's ties, but so flamboyant that fashionable women of taste don't wear it. Pansy is a dangerous color. These indexes, of course, hold double standards. What is an appropriate color then? This anxiety around necktie colors echoes queer flagging practices more broadly. Keys, handkerchiefs, earrings, and other accessories encode queer semaphores within a surveyed public. Like Victorian boutonniere, coding can go both ways, and I'm amused that the red-colored power tie was in the 1920s a queer code. Against the standards, cut from the same cloth becomes pansies in a patch. Okay. A lasting cultural aspect of mourning practices, flowers can stand in for the flesh of the departed, and like them, their eventual decay physically and in memory evoke time passing, becoming memento mori. The photo mosaic of Princess Diana by Robert Silvers reproduces her portrait through compiling a mosaic of photographed flowers arranged by color and shade. Like memento mori, it can remind mourners of their own inevitable withering, here swapped with flowers creates an emotive visual index. The photo mosaic becomes a death mask, rendered from recognizable flesh to a funerary gesture. Zooming in on the floral squares dissolves her smile funeral wreath. Diana conveys a necropastoral charge. Instead of the pastoral's eternal presence, we're literally faced with a mask made out of an effusion of flowers that contaminates living and dead, past mourning, and future deaths. The Pansy Project also uses flowers memorially. Combing news, archives, and personal accounts, Paul Harfleet plants pansies to mark sites where anti-queer violence have occurred. Viewing his project's map creates a patchwork connecting these sites in an astonishing queer floral tribute, conveying the flower's message to remember. Harfleet's project has the same potential as the public mourning of Diana. Mass-mediated images of remembrance connect and generate personal and communal memory to create images that can act as triggers for meaningful localized memory making, comprising the material objects writing in iterations as a sort of hybrid form. According to Paul Harfleet, the subtlety and elegiac quality of the pansy was reinforced through the act of planting, as kneeling in the street and digging felt like a sorrowful act. Grief maps trace emotional nodes that persist over time. Some nodes retain significance like a plaque, others fade or reassert themselves at pivotal moments, like a florist's bouquet. Creative mapping projects respond effectually in unexpected ways across time, space, and people. Projects like Gwen Shoki's Addresses project remembers former queer spaces, especially lesbian and other non-exclusively cis male bars across New York's Greenwich Village. Here, remembering the flower pot becomes an act of queer worlding, a backward glance towards a sliver of paradise, even if repressive society denies us a place in heaven. I find a different sort of queer mapping or worlding in the ephemeral decorative practice of Black trans activist and ancestor Marsha P. Johnson, who made crowns from discarded flowers in her neighborhood, Manhattan's Flower District. These flower crowns, read through queer liberatory practices, becomes an act of radical world building. Marsha adorned herself with flowers to create tangible beauty, a material poetics of survival, of queer joy. So the pansy is a flower with a human face, recalls a beloved, alive or dead. Pansy-adorned objects become memory holders, sensory and vulnerable to decay. Its face solicits remembrance and reminds us that we too will one day be mourned. Heather Love's backwardness insists on recalling the past, perverse, failed, and melancholic, a backwards art that overlaps with camp's outmoded pleasures, hauntings, trauma, and lost objects. The useless pansy maps queer attachments that are dismissed as politically unusable, objection, stigma, shame. This is the dark side of camp that resists assimilation and unsettles homonational narratives rather than accommodating them. This queer camp honors the pansy's pensée, lingering thought, and insists that we incorporate exclusions and violences into how we remember. Such bad feelings inflect queer cultural and ecological thought, and the ruins of neoliberal co-option fantasy cannot erase ongoing hostility towards queers. I propose an eco-poetics informed by queer Gothic backwardness. The Gothic's ruined inheritance helps us imagine transformation and resist gay normalizing impulses that write off the made vulnerable and the dead. How do we counter the co-option of our symbols of liberation amid neoliberal capitalism, rising extreme right policies, and homonationalism? Pinkwashing and greenwashing entwine as the garden stage for white fantasies of contained nature, whilst necropolitical pruning creates death worlds. Why taste the rainbow, trademarked, when our colors are so easily drafted? Good queers are granted conditional citizenship through alignment with nationalist rhetoric, as Ajaz Ahmad Bund and Shrestha Das note, while racialized sexual others and trans subjects remain excluded. Pride hosts rainbow police cruisers whose officers still beat protesters. Pinkwashing circulates horrific images like a gay Israeli soldier posing with a pride flag over Gaza reduced to rubble. Even the rainbowed Canada flag shores up hetero-settler power. How do we resist these green and pink idols that mask ongoing colonial repression? More pansies on patrol? Against ecological devastation, regimes that destroy queer worlds Can the pansy imagine a queer nation without becoming conscripted? Potawatomi botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer's Maple Nation engages trees as citizens across species. We are part of their body politic. Yet Bruce Erickson reminds us how other symbols, like the canoe, can spread both desire and violence through settler networks. Can the pansy refuse conscription into authoritative national identity, disturbing the garden as garrison and its maple-washed benevolence masking ongoing extractive colonial logics? How do we revolt against nationalizing a flower, even for pansy nation relations as pansy citizens? Turning towards the pansy's backwardness, its recycling and failures, the revolting pansy partakes of a queer eco-gothic camp. Camp suggests dwelling in the abject, queer stigma, shame, melancholy, a queering of how the pansy feels, bearing the brunt of its name, standing alone and slightly ridiculous, peeping about. What is it doing? What's its use? Anne Pellegrini observes that camp engages in creative recycling of the past to produce different relationships to the present and future. Drawing on Kozlowski-Sedgwick, this creative recycling of fragmentary leftover and interrupted matter, effectively rich and ventriloquistic, allows us to move beyond sentimentality. Weeds survive on disturbed land, disrupting the garden's fiction. The pansy becomes floral kin, spectral, and a horizon. What Avery Gordon calls the effective draw of being haunted, experienced not as cold knowledge, but in transformative recognition. Derek Jarman journals his care of Prospect Cottage's garden. Each flower plant, herb, driftwood, rusting iron and stone arranged both for decorative effect and mutual survival. These queered floriographic text and garden transforms aesthetic experience into pharmacopoeia, crucially as a political one. Jarman created a space for celebratory, protective, and memorial rituals of queer love and death that found little credence elsewhere. Jarman's gardening resonates with Jose Esteban Munoz's ornamentation as a blueprint, as a pansy, doing the work of imaging another life, another time, another place, daydreaming like the ornament is queer in its striking insistence on a great refusal. I'm attempting here to encapsulate link between queer eco-poetics and mourning as a sort of resistance to normative greens, as a way to think differently about how to dwell queerly on this planet. Decay, withering, wuthering, the pansy death drop operates as gesture, queer exhaustion and persistent becoming. Abject yet dramatic, the queer Gothic pansy endures in the cold. Withering is method, wet, miserable, yet feeling itself. This melancholic joy and pain unfolds in my practice. Chainmail, experimental dyeing, crayon frottage, garments, and patchwork perform registers of brief desire as a sensibility, encoding protective labor and its success. Through flower codes, queer grief meets queer eco-poetics, sweat, torn clothes, soap, fragrance, metal, mementos, digital remnants, tracing the virtual and the dead, a softer protesting energy, both melancholic and curious. I'm thinking about sex, death, and pansies fucking against nature, perhaps a political aesthetic that recognizes a libidinous action and a seeding spent uselessly. Like Leo Bersani's example of a leather man who, when he opens his mouth, reads Jane Austen in a fanciful voice, my work plays the butch as drag. I think about how to acknowledge and disown internalized oppression, to flab our pansy tongues, to commune rather than be divided into respectable and oppressed. Caspar Heinemann's queer plant poetics, Fucking Pansies, shows how slur overtakes its non-queer associations. Unless the pansy faces you, you might not think of the plant, while its link with pensiveness, a quality of gentle sadness or wistfulness, is only softly retained. But pansies love the fanciful, wasting time in reflective action rather than stiff masculinity, already masks empty performance. When a pansy boy is elided with their flower, they become one and the same in the homophobe's diction. The pansy plants their software of flower and queer, The homo here is not only homosexual, but self-profligate, pansies loving pansies. Reclaiming pansy can enable queer ecological thought, a delicate cultivar, and a cultivated identity or self-fashioning. What sorts of eco-poetics are then possible? My own trajectory traces eco-gothic gestures. In my MFA Gorenthals grief robe, I fiber-etched or devorayed floral patterns into black velvet, grinding the inky flock and performing Camp Gothic excess as an eco-grief response after flooding and erosion impacted Minising or Toronto Islands. The pansy here shaped my self-dance, mimicking the flower's velvet pensiveness. I also created a fragrance reliquaire as a memento to the gay beach. I consider the ruins that we are being dealt with by the petro-patriarchy, a manosphere of toxic discourse polluting society and ecologies with big oil energy. I think about the possibility of queer armor to both protect and also render vulnerable. The links of chainmail create a porous mesh full of holes. In Creeper, I used rust as a material and metaphor. Over time, the rusted steel flowers will efface the rest of the work, consuming it. I'm thinking about how this works as a way to interrupt a fantasy of permanence, how the oxidization will creep outward. I'm thinking about the pansy's peeping Tom face peering back, how straight homophobic culture treats gender and sexually diverse, non-binary and transgender people, or otherwise racialized and othered people as invasive, alien plants to be weeded out. But I also lean toward a different speculative mode, towards a queer world where flowers will bloom into the entire piece. Thinking through a pansy Gothic, erotically, the plant slips into dark mode, cruising the necropolis edge. An eco-Gothic camp lets the pansy flicker between winsome and weird, a minor horror icon in a lineage of queering plant aesthetics. The double identity of pansy and pansy creates an exchange between plant and queer in a necropastoral register of my work. Dragging, flowery, ornamented, sparkle, Nelly, sparkle! Kate Sandilands' Fear of a Queer Planet threads the horror plant from Wells' predatory orchids to the Day of the Triffids and into the melodrama of Audrey's Feed Me, Seymour in Little Shop of Horrors. These monstrous eroticized plants rendered as exoticized, effete, racialized, luring straight white cis male protagonists towards their eventual consumption by the very plants they are strangely attracted to, along vectors of smell, color, and morphology. The Floral Code warns, don't gift a man a pansy lest it invite bad luck. Don't pluck a pansy when it's wet, lest a loved one dies. Holds this queer provocation, don't cultivate pansies, lest you become one yourself. Along this queer Gothic sensibility of these horror plant vectors, in which I find queer recognition, I consider how the pansy's queer Gothic might also perform a recuperative drag on this cultural matter. The pansy is apt as a queer thinking figure that looks backwards to allegorize our ruptured temporality, and it opens up a necromantic field, inviting a different sort of flourishing within the present's haunted ecology. I hope this presentation has been pensée-provoking. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, thank you for the reminder. Okay. Cool. Hi, my name is Haley. As Erin introduced me, I'm in the MFA program in Intermediate Arts, and today I will be talking about queer feminist techno-gardening. Human action threatens Earth's biodiversity now more than ever before. In 2019, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services reported that 25% of global plant and animal species are now endangered, posing a serious risk to the sustainability of species and ecosystem functions that humans rely on for habitable living. Timothy Morton calls global warming the cause of this current age of mass extinction a hyperobject. Hyperobjects are defined as things that are massively distributed in time and space relative to humans. These objects are so vast that they transcend our perception and comprehension of time. Examples of hyperobjects include global warming, evolution, plastic, capitalism, and commodified constructs under capitalism, such as gender. Within this ungraspable sense of scale, hyperobjects bring about the end of the world. Here, the end of the world does not refer to the apocalyptic landscapes imagined in dystopic science fictions. It means that hyperobjects destroy the concept of world and the aesthetics of worlding. In recognizing a hyperobject, nature as background and humankind as foreground dissolves. Inclement weather patterns that were once the backdrop of human life on Earth are now at the very fore of our perceptions. Need backgrounds, which need foregrounds. When we can see everywhere, the world as a significant bounded horizoning entity disappears. We have no world because the objects that functioned as invisible scenery have dissolved. And so, if the world as we understand it has ended, what do we do? Morton suggests that accepting the intimacy with hyperobjects that occurs in the collapse of background and foreground allows us to turn from nature to ecology for a deepened sense of attunement and awareness. In turn, this enables alliances between humans and non-humans when reimagining our present and future. Recognizing that the concept of world has been crafted by capitalism, industrialism, and colonialism, it feels urgent more than ever to find ways to examine how social values, behaviors, and knowledge systems have put us in a position where nature is an extractable resource and passive backdrop for our leisure, consumption, and profit. For me, gardens offer rich possibility for deconstructing these nature cultures and becoming intimate and uncomfortable with the realities of Morton's hyperobjects. In many ways, gardening is a direct act of worlding. The Garden of Eden, garden cities, botanic gardens, and green urban architecture movements paint idyllic, protected, orderly, and romantic visions of utopia where humans live in harmony and happiness with nature. The solar punk science fiction genre is perhaps one of the latest movements to reflect these aesthetic tropes. The contrast of this insistent worlding, despite the end of the world according to Morton, is a curious dynamic. Building on Haraway's notion of sewing worlds, bridging nature, culture, technology, organism, language, and machine, techno-gardening is a research creation methodology that considers the garden as a site of queer entangled intimacy and as a space for staying with the trouble of worlding. Seeking intentional kinship with plants and machines, I consider non-binary hybridities, relationalities, and disparate temporalities across these alliances. I'm interested in how informatic, algorithmic, and machinic forms of life find their way into dialogue with plants and humans, not as tools of observation, simulation, and measurement, but as communicative counterparts. Alter Fluorescence was my first project towards developing the concept of techno-gardening. It is a computer-generated animation presented as a panoramic projection that immerses viewers in a virtual ecosystem where animated flora evolve under a genetic algorithm striving towards a biologically ideal target. Within this work, I take on the role of a gardener scientist tending to the system through algorithmic interventions that disrupt the machine's ability to reach its target. By pacing the machine's optimization with chance, slowness, and randomization, a mutagenic Luna moth becomes my agential proxy for interacting with the virtual flora. As the infinitely iterating animation unfolds, coded intervention acts as a gentle resistance to extractive, homogenizing processes of the genetic algorithm. Around the same time as I developed alter fluorescence, I wrote a techno-gardening manifesto to solidify my intentions with this concept. Originally titled the Informational Gardening Manifesto, it was written in a diagrammatic format. Here I imagined the manifesto as a rhizomatic structure in an effort to step away from tree-like systems that reproduce notions of linearity. Inspired by the web practice of digital gardening, a form of personal website building where the site acts as a free-form work-in-progress wiki, I'm interested in how this web format creates contextual associations rather than linear timelines typically associated with personal blogs. Within the ethos of digital gardening, notes are published as half-finished thoughts that will grow and evolve as new contextual links arise over time. Extending this beyond language and writing, techno-gardening prioritizes art making with kin as its primary form of link making. Here I'm interested in sympoetic forms of synthesis, where making informs thinking, which informs making, and so on, in a cyclical pattern. My aim is that the techno-garden is not just simply the background for this remediation with nature, but rather it is the ecosystem, the organism, interaction, and environment through which this negotiation occurs. Haraway's notion of sympoiesis recognizes that nothing is ever really self-organizing. In the complex and dynamic relationships between myself and other, I'm interested in the possibilities of making with, through art science worldings as a method of sitting with the damages and achievements of colonial and post-colonial natural cultural histories. Oliver Grau, in 2004, in his History of Immersive Art, situates art science practices within systems of illusion, where art that reproduces scientific concepts through simulation and virtual image making. This blurry space of simulation as a tool for the visualization of science, to me, reads as a form of art that champions scientific novelty, innovation, and spectacle, which through a feminist lens can be read as harmful utilities of capitalism that reinforce background-foreground relationships with nature. Tracing the trajectory of evolution through science to art is an interesting journey through the controversial artificial A-life movement that combines genetic algorithms and 3D computer modeling. Most simply, genetic algorithms are mathematical adaptations of Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, where individuals with advantageous traits are more likely to survive and reproduce. The algorithm progresses through a series of generations that evolve a gene pool towards an identified target, following the rules of selection, crossover, and mutation, mimicking the natural selection process. Simulating evolution in the hyperspeed of the algorithm, researchers noticed that life-like emergent behavior occurred, spurring forays into possibilities of artificial life. Today, these algorithms are used to solve complex optimization problems in machine learning and AI development, and have common applications as search tools within sciences, finance, engineering, and security industries. Returning to ultrafluorescence, this work ultimately aims to call attention to how this algorithm operates as an abstraction that results in the homogenization of a population where heteronormative bias is inherent to the algorithm itself. Emphasizing heterosexual reproduction as the main character within narratives of survival of the fittest, this marginalizes queer and gendered identities who operate through alternative means of survival. The art science worldings Haraway speaks of are different. Turning to one of her sympoetic examples, the Crochet Coral Reef Project combines mathematics, marine biology, environmental activism, ecological consciousness raising, fiber arts, and community practices. Recalling Morton's intimacy with hyperobjects in the face of mass extinction, questions of where, why, and how else we choose to enact intimacy is pertinent. Haraway offers an interesting perspective of how one might engage with mathematical abstraction as a method for crafting intimacy without proximity. Intimacy without proximity is not virtual presence, it is real presence, but in loopy materialities. The abstractions of mathematics or crocheting are a kind of lure to an effective cognitive ecology stitched in fiber arts. The crochet coral reef is a practice of caring without the neediness of touching by camera or hand in yet another voyage of discovery. Ultrafluorescence builds intimacy without proximity and a practice of caring through the creation of a virtual immersive ecosystem for the endangered American water willow, the Justicia americana. This plant is an aqueous rhizomatic wildflower that can be found across North America. While its populations are stable elsewhere, this species has been in steady decline within so-called Canada since 1982. Within Quebec, this wildflower can be found on Île Rock, a small island in the St. Lawrence River near the Lachine Rapids south of Montreal. This location is one of only 13 known between Quebec and Ontario. Threats to the water willow include loss of habitat from dams and water management practices, competition with invasive species, the erosion of shorelines from severe storms, human trampling, and water pollution. Due to its endangered status, it is illegal to collect and cultivate these plants. Now, at this point, you might ask, why care about this plant and why make a virtual ecosystem for it? Firstly, for me, addressing these questions requires the understanding that caring about a specific non-human species in a capitalist society is almost always intrinsically tied to its utility or beauty, hence its economic value as a raw material or commodity. Yasmin Ostendorf Rodriguez teases this out in her book, Let's Become Fungal, where she discusses how fungi that get scientific attention are almost always perceived as parasites infecting precious agricultural monocrops. Now, the water willow is not a parasite, and to my knowledge, it has no specific purpose in the human realm. For me, this is important. If I am to truly engage with ideas of entangled becoming with, it's crucial that I am disentangling myself from requiring a capitalist purpose behind my means. Secondly, the illegality of collecting and cultivating an endangered plant species creates a necessity for imagining other ways of forming intimacy without proximity. The title of alterflorescence is a play on codenaming conventions and the term altergorithm, a practice theorized by Timotheus Vermeulen. Combining words alternative and algorithm, he describes artistic practices that posit as-if statements in contrast to what-if questions. By extending the possibilities of the present instead of trying to predict the future, Vermeulen speculates that it becomes possible to envisage alternative scenarios that defy all prediction. Here, alterflorescence as a real-time animation uses an intentionally altered genetic algorithm to play into the creation of an alternative proposition. Like the mathematical abstractions of the crochet coral reef, the virtuality of the work aims to be a lure to an effective ecological awareness. The Luna moth plays the instigator of this proposition. When a moth spawns, the machine's camera speeds up, tracking the moth's location as it attempts to find a particular inflorescence within the scene. When the moth finds its target, a chance mutation event occurs, and this mutagenic cycle repeats until the end of the moth's life cycle, upon which the machine resumes its methodical observation. I described the relationship between moth and flora as a multi-species coalition, inciting similarities between Haraway's concepts of multi-species flourishing and to the concept of queer alliance. The mutual offerings of flora and fauna form relations where fauna encourage variability of flora and flora provide refuge for fauna. Together, they form a queer kinship that opposes the machine's evolutionary heteronormativity. Karen Barad's essay, Transmaterialities, offers insight to the matter of virtuality as a space for these queer political imaginaries. Virtual matter is an imaginative, material exploration of ongoing transformation. It is a wild exploration of trans-animacy, self-experimentations, self-recreations, in a radical undoing of individualism. It is uncountably multiple, mutable. Nature is agential, transmateriality, transmatter reality, and its ongoing reconfiguring, where trans is not a matter of changing in time from this to that, but an undoing of this and that. This transmattering of queer nature virtual kinship is a radical undoing of the naturalness of natural selection. In alterflorescence, this manifests through the mutagenic relationship between moth and flora as an undoing of evolutionary process, revealing a non-essentialist ecology. While alterflorescence engages evolution and algorithm through intervention and disruption, SOS, Symbiotic Orchid Search, explores symbiosis as a method for crafting as opposed to altering. SOS is a speculative plant-machine symbiont composed of Phalaenopsis orchids, a semi-water culture hydroponic system, and choreographically programmed light, sound, and water pumps, inspired by evolutionary biologist Lynn Margulis's theory of symbiosis, and a novel evolutionary algorithm called the Symbiotic Organism Search Algorithm. This work explores a shared process of making with between plants, humans, and machine to propose co-evolutionary possibilities for creating systems of care. Phalaenopsis orchids are one of the most widely cultivated orchid species within the global plant market today and can be found readily at most stores where plants are available for purchase. Despite their highly cultivated status, orchids maintain perceptions of rarity, and their sought-after significance within the history of evolutionary and reproductive botanical theory has cemented them as symbols of heteronormative beauty, desire, wealth, power, trade, and capitalism. Anders B. in 2016 develops a cultural history of orchids from their Greek origins as symbols of sexuality, fertility, and erotic power. Drawing on popular imaginaries within literature and film between 1880 and 1970, he explores how orchids came to be painted as deceptive, morally fluid, lethal killers and tricksters during the period of botanic imperialism. This persona comes from Darwin's work on insect pollination in his theorizing of natural selection, where Darwin hypothesized that the orchid is coevolutionary in nature through a mechanism called pseudocopulation. Pseudocopulation is where the plant mimics the anatomy of a female wasp, therefore tricking the male wasp into pollinating them. Asking, is there a queer Darwin? Donovan Schaefer, 2021, offers a close reading of queer feminist scholarly debate around Darwin's orchids and the semantics of heterosexual and symbiotic bacterial ontologies. Schaefer recounts various letters and writings from Darwin on orchid fertilization, where we learn that most orchids are bisexual and hermaphroditic, in addition to being dependent on insects for reproduction. Although these discoveries were second to Darwin's pursuit of proving natural selection, Schaefer claims that Darwin's evolution has been queer all along, and that it is in fact predominant heterosexual and patriarchal ontologies that are responsible for interpreting Darwin's work on evolution and orchids as heteronormative. Recalling the perspective of ultrafluorescence, Schaefer reveals how a genetic algorithm reenacts this ontology of heterosexuality. It takes a snapshot of an ongoing fluid process and tries to superimpose that image on the entire time stream of desiring life forms, past, present, and future. By transforming an ongoing process into a finite, time-restricted search tool with select inputs and outputs, we lose track of how evolution is a variable process that incites this variability through differences of desire. Orchids have a unique ability as epiphytes to grow out of soil. In their natural habitat, they are typically found on bark, tree bark, or surfaces where their roots act above ground as feelers and anchors to organic matter. They absorb water from the air around them and typically have symbiotic relationships with microbial fungi and bacteria, which have been shown to enhance the plant's health. Working from these contexts, SOS reroutes the orchid's complicated cultural narratives through a processual and relational lens that recognizes the plant's existing co-evolutionary and symbiotic intelligences. Extending this to the plant's propositional cohabitants, the hydroponic machine, and myself as caretaker, I also ask if a machine can move beyond its outcome-oriented architecture and its role as the observer, the optimizer, the extrapolator, towards collaborator, co-creator, and co-evolver. Reminded of Haraway's sentiment that nothing is really ever self-sufficient, each cohabitant of the system becomes a life support to each other. Tending to the hydroponic system keeps the machine running smoothly, which delivers vital sustenance that keeps the orchids alive, which provides me with beauty and future imaginaries of queerness despite the end of the world. Asking what it means to remain in continuously shifting, adapting, flowing, and looping relation beyond oneself, I am reminded that time flows from things and that the work of the techno-gardening is about forming urgent ecological awareness. Realizing that there are lots of different temporality formats is basically what ecological awareness is. It's equivalent to acknowledging in a deep way the existence of beings that aren't you, with whom you coexist. Once you've done that, you can't unacknowledge it. There's no going back. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Abby. I am a transdisciplinary artist and facilitator, and currently in my final year of my MFA here at Concordia. So to start, my title Bitter Fruit, Cultivating Delicious Futures. In this, I'll be talking a bit about my research on bitterness and kind of the little tendrils that I follow through with that. Bitter fruits, it's a cultural saying that describes negative or unwanted outcomes from some action. So like the bitter fruits of our labor. It's a meaning that layers well on the generally derogatory term for effeminate men and queers, people of fruit or fruity, people whose behaviors cause an unwanted glitch in the existing systems. But bitter fruits also means fruits that contain bitter compounds. This includes grapefruits, olives, bitter melons, cranberries. And in this talk, I expand to speak about how bitterness is a vital and complicated piece of our relationships with things that grow. My subtitle, Cultivating Delicious Futures, speaks to a desire for a utopic future found through finding ourselves in and reimagining our kinships with the living entities that make up our worlds. But I challenge this desire for delicious futures by asking how bitterness can help us reframe these fantasies as something more messy, non-innocent, and effectively complex. My own creative research in flavor science and bitterness is rooted in performance, interactive installation, and community collaborations and engagements. I will share some bits of this research throughout the presentation as we explore the role of bitterness in disrupting and de-idealizing queer ecological relationships. So first, I'll nerd out a bit on the flavor science behind bitterness and how we experience taste. I will then trace the disturbing queer attachments involved in the consumption of bitterness. And finally, I will ask what drives us to crave a queer utopic future and idealized queer dynamics with the growing things around us. And what would it look like to welcome in the bitter parts as well? So how does bitterness work? I'll go broader with flavor. We experience flavor when we consume something and our body translates taste molecules and scent molecules into signals in our brain. Each of our taste buds on our tongue, soft palate, and esophagus, they detect one specific type or genre of molecule. So that's either sugars, acids, sodium, toxins, and glutamate. This translates into sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami or savory. These taste buds receive information through taste pores, which are teeny tiny openings that allow the taste molecules to connect with taste receptors. They then send this information to the gustatory area of our brain. We sense spiciness, which I know people always wonder where that is. We sense spiciness through pain receptors that are tricked by spice molecules into sending heat signals to our brain when there is no actual increase in temperature. The other aspect of flavor, aside from taste, is aroma. So those are scent molecules, and that's what adds nuance to what we taste. You can know something is bitter, but it's the aroma and combination of other tastes that tell you what it actually is, whether it has the citrusy floral aroma of a grapefruit or the earthy vegetal aroma of collard greens. And that hits the back of your throat and then kind of behind your nose. So our brains are tightly link taste and smell, olfaction, with the brain's emotional and memory centers. The olfactory system has direct access to these areas, the hippocampus and the amygdala, which makes smell and taste really potent memory cues, and also really tied to our emotions, which is, I think, in part why so many phrases like, oh, they're so bitter, or oh, what a sweet guy, all relate to kind of an emotional response to a person. So when I learn about something cool like how we process and experience flavor, I get curious about how other people experience it as well. And I've found collaging together a really fun and engaging way to share stories and experiences and learn more about what other folks think is something that I'm nerding out So my first series, workshop series, exploring flavor through collage, happened in 2024 and culminated in publishing a recipe zine titled Holding Flavor, Recipes to Take You Outside of Time and Place. It is a compilation of participants' collage contributions and their spanning nostalgic familial recipes to regular kind of everyday recipes to fantasies that they dreamed up and wanted to make. So following this, I started to get more focused on different aspects of flavor and taste, specifically bitterness. And I engaged a similar process last winter, hosting a workshop in Erin's seminar course titled Plants, Gardens, and Critical Ecologies. In it, participants responded to a series of prompts focusing on the visualization and word associations they have with bitterness, again tying the flavor experiencing with psychological and emotional responses. I compiled a zine on flavor, memory, and bitterness. Stay tuned for its release. But many of the visuals you see in this presentation include pieces from this collage workshop. And in this workshop, I provided a wide range of art and science magazines, in addition to scanned and printed excerpts from 2 books, Eros the Bittersweet by Anne Carson, and the Bitterness chapter of Flavorama by Ariel Johnson. These 2 books were central in forming my curiosity around bitterness, and by including them in the collage materials, I learned what common themes were particularly compelling to other folks, which did help direct some of my research. So some things that stood out to participants was the idea of bitterness as a mechanism for sensing and warning about things that might be toxic or poisonous. That bitterness indicates that not everything we eat wants to be eaten. And these bitter molecules are there by design. And some bitter molecules are medicine. And the other theme that actually might not be here is the idea that bitterness likes a chaperone. It likes to be chaperoned by sweet, salty, or sour. And that is how we find pleasure in bitterness, is by accompanying it with other elements. So, as I described, bitter and sour taste molecules, as well as spice molecules, are typically defense mechanisms in plants. Bitterness is found in a wide range of chemical compounds, and I'm particularly fascinated by bitterness for a few reasons. In humans, we have a greater variety of bitter receptors than any other flavor receptor. This is because of the variety of potential toxins that carry bitter molecules, and many coming from plants. I'm also fascinated by the way flavor terms like bitterness have been consumed by some languages to also represent emotional, psychological, and physical states beyond simply describing a taste. So in English, embittered, bittersweet, bitter work, a bitter wind, bitter medicine, are all using bitter to describe experiences and states beyond taste. If we're to understand bitterness as a defense mechanism for plants, then I think we can consider this a type of communication. It communicates toxicity, but at low doses, some bitter plants can be medicinal to us, compared to their effect on an insect or fungus that might also be trying to eat them. And yeah, if bitterness is a plant's way of deterring plant eaters, then this must be some communication that we can maybe learn from. But some key things when we're thinking about it as communication are, is it all about humans? Who are they communicating with? Are we just intercepting a communication to the ant that they don't want around? And what types of relationships are we engaging in when we disregard this communication and take pleasure in a plant's bitterness? If that bitterness is telling us don't eat it, then what is happening when we transgress that boundary? Is it thrill-seeking behavior to eat bitter things? They're indicative of toxicity. Are we transgressing boundaries when we take pleasure in a Negroni? And is that part of the pleasure? We've evolved in a world where plants, we're already making these molecules, and we've adapted to them. Through bitterness, we can position humans relationally as a factor in the way some plants cultivate their own respective levels of bitterness, but we aren't central to it. In farming, we engage in co-evolutionary processes where we cultivate the plants to exhibit traits that are pleasurable or nutritious to us, and the plants develop traits that will ensure their continued reproduction. And it's not always about going from bitter to sweetness. There's a lot of nonlinearity in this co-evolutionary relationship. And grapefruit is a kind of perfect example of that. It's a cross between pomelo and sweet orange that was developed in Barbados in the 1700s. And it's now one of the 4 favorite citrus fruits globally. Who knows what that means? But it is, there's a interesting tension between us cultivating something that says, "Don't eat me." I have also been exploring flavor through interactive performance spaces. So in my installation project, How Does It Seek Flavor? I installed a giant tongue-shaped screen with slits in it and projected moving images across its surface. Visitors responded to audio prompts that invited them to use their body to interpret flavor experiences. In this work, I was particularly interested in the metaphors that draw from different tastes and had a desire to create an experience that evoked the weird and erotic that exists in taste and flavor experiencing generally. So I've got a short clip that we'll watch a bit of from that installation. It's a little dark, hard to take film.
Imagine your whole body could taste. How would you move? Let's isolate the sensation into just one limb. Come, take a sleeve, slide it on your arm, hand, leg, head, whatever. Let it become your tasting appendage. This sleeve is made of thousands of taste receptors that draw in data and envelop you in sensation. Take it behind the curtain. Explore it alone. How does it coil and unfurl? How does it seek flavor? Now show me. Find a slit in the membrane. Taste the edges of it. Sample and slide. Nudge your tasting appendage through. Is it still a limb? Is it a tongue? Something else? How does your appendage move when it tastes sweetness? Sticky with nectar, seeking more. Sweet tooth, sweet as pie, short and sweet.
So you can watch the rest of that on my website, but just again for reference, the participants were coming around and behind the screen to push their appendages through. And in this process of queering ecologies, I find we can encounter ourselves craving to be mirrored in this world around us, in the growing world around us, in their sex variations, reproductive or sexual practices, and their kinship structures. Bitterness and bitter molecules as a sensory experience and as a communication, in my mind, effectively avoid this type of imprinting. Ideally, no one wants to be seen as wholly bitter. And well, under the umbrella of queer, that process of seeking to see yourselves in nature and divided from feels a bit more like an act of normalization, of finding proof that we naturally occur elsewhere in the world, as opposed to embracing the troubling, disrupting, disturbing, unsettling acts of queering. I'm curious, do we really need to find our gay sex in the weird growing world around us? Or can we, as Donna Haraway puts it, stay with the trouble? So in his book, Disturbing Attachments, Genet, Modern Pederasty and Queer History, author Kadji Amin investigates how queer theory selects its examples to prove our contemporary political imaginings, and he applies a method of attachment genealogy to trace our selective memory that leaves behind the distasteful or the uncomfortable. Amin proposes de-idealization as a strategy for learning to hold the imperfect, troubling relations that come out of queer eros and the politics of queerness as a method of expanding the context that informs the use of the term queer, rather than trying to redeem or critique the mess that we're in. I quote, de-idealization de-exceptionalizes queerness in order to analyze queer possibility as inextricable from relations of power, queer deviance as intertwined with normativity, and queer alternatives as not necessarily alternatives. Amin suggests the queer tradition of living with damage in a damaged world, but I don't necessarily see this as damage or failure, as Jack Halberstam proposes. Rather, it is the tradition of living with disturbance, disruption, and contradictions in a world filled with this. I think we can use de-idealization to acknowledge the cravings many of us have to uncover utopic queer relations or models for idealized futures, and to own the messy realities while also seeking to be descriptive, curious, and learn to sit in the mess. I use this approach to investigate the communications that bitterness delivers in plant-to-plant eater relationships. What is the role of bitterness in entangling messy, uncomfortable ecological relations? And what are the dynamics that we are participating in? The plant-eater relationship is layered in communication, nurturance, and transgression. Kinship is a word that holds weight. It is generally understood to be the practice that comprises relationships with social, material, economic, and temporal practices. This is more than simply identification or belonging. It holds an embodied weight and requires renewal, repetition, and care. So Elizabeth Freeman highlights the importance of the bodily dependence and renewal in kinship. As a practice, kinship is resolutely corporal. Its meaning and functions draw from a repertoire of understandings about the body, from a set of strategies oriented around the body's limitations and possibilities. I see bitterness as a pathway for earnest kin-making, but only if we're willing to put in the effort to listen to what that bitterness is telling us. Taking pleasure in consuming bitter foods is participating in a disturbing queer attachment relationship that requires a de-idealized approach. Bitterness is a boundary, it's a warning, a risk, and a gift of communication, whether it's from plants or person. They are all saying something urgent. They're saying, don't consume me. This type of labor wears down my existence. I'll share myself with you, but only in small doses. And I could help you or hurt you, so please proceed with caution. It is up to us to determine if this message is actually for us, and how we want to relate to it. Do we engage in conversation with the bitterness in an effort to authentically embody kin building? Cultivating delicious futures means accepting the distasteful and the non-innocent with the delicious, and cherishing that queer incoherence. Thank you for your time.
Okay. We have some time, a good amount of time actually, we finished a little early, for questions from the audience. So I have a mic to pass to anyone who is interested.
We can pass this mic, Aaron. Go on. Also, anyone joining us online, if you have any comments or questions, pop those into the chat. We can read them out. Do we see a hand? Anyone here? Someone's got to be first. There we go.
Thank you all for those papers. They were fantastic. I really liked the strange link between Morris's wagging of the pansy tongue and the tasting appendages in Ali's paper there at the end. My question is for Morris, and I'm struggling to formulate it as a question, but I liked the sort of journey you took us on through pansies in nightlife, pansies in literature, pansies as a color, pansy as a way to be, or pansy as a way not to be. I'm just wondering if in like 2025, there's sort of a movement towards re-embracing the pansy, either in theory, in art, or in literature, if you know what I mean with that question.
Thanks for your question, Dean. I think, I guess the question of reclaiming the pansy, I think like other queer slurs, I mean, we can even use the example of straight, which was originally a slur that queer people used against heteronormativity. I think all of these things are open to, linguistic twists and turns and reclamation. But I think one of the things I was trying to think about is some of the dangers of reclaiming something until it becomes normative again. So I think like some of those kind of patches of history, et cetera, and cultural forms can be inspiring when we look backwards and then forwards as well. But there is a danger, I think, in kind of, and I love that you brought up Kajiamin too, because if we try to realize some of those things, then we also like lose the kind of potency of that. But I also think, if I've been called a pansy before, and I think, well, thank you, like that's really nice of you. Even if it's been like thrown at me with hatred. I don't know, that doesn't really answer your question, but. Oh, the last slide saying be a pansy?
Yeah, I guess I'm sort of asking you to talk. You started to answer it, but you said you've been called a pansy, and you said thank you, and then you told us all to go and be a pansy. And I'm sort of wondering if you're articulating yourself there in dialogue with some other thinkers or artists, or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think across a range of people, like especially Casper Heinemann's essay, "Fucking Pansies," which he's really thinking about the plant itself, its sexuality, and the slur, and the queer person as a plant person also. So I think that was like a very big through line for me in developing the talk. But I found all these kind of funny asides as I went, including that in the medieval name for the Viola tricolor, which is the ancestor of the pansy, that it was originally called like Viola Trinitatis, which is the Holy Trinity. And at some point someone said, that's a dangerous thing to call it. We have to call it something else because it's blasphemous to God. So I think there's like these nuances in the histories. And also in terms of naming conventions, I mean, all those color standards, which are kind of ridiculous when we look back at them, there is a kind of messiness, which I think is interesting as material for reinterpretation.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
There was a question on Zoom, which I can read out here. It's a question for Haley. A question from McKenna. Could you speak more to the manifesto you wrote as a diagram and resisting the tree structure with hierarchy making.
Sure. So this reflects on Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the rhizome, in that they talk about the tree as a rooted and hierarchical structure that technology is actually sort of like formed on, where like binary code and like file systems are nested in these sort of like hierarchical structures. And part of the concept of the rhizome is thinking about things along lines instead of being points. And so instead of each word being maybe a focus, it's about what happens for me when the words are put together in relation to one another. Yeah, thank you.
Hi guys, those were great panels. Thank you so much. This is a question for Morris, but I think all three of you would be able to speak to it. The first thing is, I feel like I need from you, Morris, a sort of a layperson's definition of necropastoral. I feel like there is a necropolitics that sort of is moving through, or at least a sort of an adjacent concern in each of these presentations, which, when contrasted against, I guess, more known discourses around queer life and queer flourishing, particularly in relation to queer ecologies, to me poses a lot of productive problems. And so I was thinking about, Morris, in your work, the pansy, and I just, as an aside, where was Alice in Wonderland? There's like perfect pansies in Alice in Wonderland. I really needed that reference. But thinking about Through the Looking Glass and Alice in Wonderland, and again, through Deleuze, the idea that plants, there's a pre-individual field or a pre-individual force before there's an individual. And when we think about queerness in relation to that, I think of it as an angle or a slant on a perspectival slant that has a certain force to it. And so before the pansy is a pre-individual, and of course there's sort of an aggregation around the symbology of the pansy, which I think, in some ways, I think is super generative and, has a lot of, traditional queer aesthetics associated with it. But then you bring in the concept of the necropastoral, and I'm curious, in for example, the chainmail that you showed, you sort of showed that the pansy becomes overtaken by the bush around it in a way. The rust matches what the pattern, I think, that you've already created in the chainmail. So I'm wondering at what point the necro comes in here, where that turn is in your process, and also just, I'm also wondering where, especially in relation to cruising, camouflage comes in, and what the audacity of a pansy does or says, or how it interferes with, again, more traditional queer codes of cruising.
Matthew, that's a really complex question, but thank you. Generative, I think. So thank you for that. I'm going to answer two parts of it, and then I'll leave the rest of it open if other of you want to answer it. So the necropastoral is Joelle McSweeney, who's an American author and writer, poet. She coined the term in 2015, and it's a kind of eco-poetics of death and decay and death worlds, which is kind of imbricated with the pastoral tradition. So if you think back to thousands of years of the pastoral tradition being this idea of the Arcadian greens, these green imaginary spaces which are perfect or whatever, but they're also spaces which are inflected or inflicted with death. Like death is the principal resident of the Arcadian pastoral. And I think when that comes into queerness, so she's looking at kind of like what are the actual ruins that necropolitics have caused, and how does this imaginary of green space play into that as well? We can think of, green is also a color of toxicity, especially chemical toxicity. So she's really kind of complicating our imaginary of the pastoral as this kind of, bucolic thing where there's some shepherds fucking in the distance, or even some of the pastoral imagery which is used, for example, in Brokeback Mountain, et cetera. So I think the necropastoral has a sharpness that's useful for thinking around the death rolls that are produced not only amongst humankind, but also inflicted on other ecologies. So I think like that's a framework of a sensibility too. That in my work, I really think about Camp's place in that, the excesses of the necropolitics, combined with this kind of idea of frivolity in a sense. So that's one thing. I hope that gives a shorthand
Super
definition
helpful.
for it.
Yeah.
And I'll just censor that the rust piece that I showed, Creeper, it's the flowers which are made out of the rusted links, and then the rust blooms from them out towards the rest of the piece. So it's not the background which is consuming the rest of it, it's the flowers that are consuming everything. And I think that was my queer metaphor for letting pansies flourish to a point where everyone's a pansy. I don't know.
Yeah, it was really cool to see that the through line of, finding a little more rust in the ideas around queer flourishing. And yeah, I think like what's so rich in the act of queering is not us finding better ways of being or finding easier ways of being at some question mark future point. It's about finding a more raw way of being that enables transformation and disruption more effectively.
If there aren't any other questions, I had a question that is kind of related to this, and you might have just answered it, Abby, but I found it really interesting. Each of you is finding metaphoric or pedagogic capacity and in sometimes in the individual agency of plants. But you're also suggesting that human interaction, intervention, or interpretation might build these new relationships between us humans and plants and beyond, the more than human. And I really appreciated that each of you brought in this, in your own way, this is my term for it, but like a productive pessimism, right? These overarching ideas of queering nature. And, of course, that's, my first thought is like, is that just nature being nature, which is not positivist, right? Nor evolutionary invested in failure, to Q Halberstam. But I am kind of curious, this builds off what you just said, Abby. If we move towards such forms of de-idealization, what are new horizons for liberation? Because we're also not fully liberated. And maybe liberation will always be messy, as it has been, and raw and incomplete. But I'm just curious to hear more your all's thoughts on that. Like, is the pessimism productive? Can it ever be? So for any of you.
Pass it down to you.
Sure. Yeah, is the pessimism, or like how can the pessimism be productive? I honestly don't see it as pessimism either. I see it as quite hopeful in the sense that we're already in the muck, so let's keep going. And in the sense that like, if we strive towards a queering that is disruptive, destabilizing, transformative, then we don't know what's beyond the horizon of that, and that's part of the value of that approach. And it also interrupts complacency. It interrupts the the pride flag on banks. Like, that's not part of anything. So yeah, I see it as interruptive and generative, in the same way, like, there's generativeness in the in death and rebirth, that kind of vibe.
Yeah, I have like similar thoughts, I guess. I think for me, I'm thinking a lot of these days about like contradictions of like utopian spaces, but then the sort of like the hopeful optimism of them kind of like ultimately maybe being like a fallacy of some sort. But I don't know what our pathways are to liberation. I think that contradiction is something that feels uneasy in me. And so I think wrestling with that is like part of what I'm thinking about within my work. And you talked about the idea of like interrupting complacency. I think part of it too is that it's so easy to be pacified by the like everything going on in the world these days. They're like with distractions, and I think part of that work is finding ways to stay engaged and being thoughtful and caring and going through the world with agency.
I think because I also really love Anne Carson's Eros the Bittersweet, and also this idea from Haraway of symbiosis, like the idea of making with and then having that be kind of iterative. I think those two things can also be thought of through pensiveness, which is a kind of related term to, or thought, or emotion even. I remember, so I think like gentle sorrow, but also like the time to think through things, which certainly under carceral capitalism, we're not meant to have any time to think anymore. And I also think about Nicole Seymour's book, Bad Environmentalisms. I'm getting the name slightly wrong, but where she talks about how hope and despair are kind of the same coin, just like flipping around. And so we have to kind of think past those two kind of hyper emotional states or binary. And she talks about how curiosity and actually camp can be other affects or other ways of looking at the crises that we're facing or that have already overcome us in some ways. I mean, the environmental crisis is a bigger one that way. So I think like curiosity is a really interesting effect to think through through the problems that we're having, or towards the idea of liberation also.
That's great.
Other questions?
Thank you very much. Those are absolutely fabulous papers. I thoroughly enjoyed those. I'm going to ask a question that sort of emerges from a point that I'm wrestling with that you made, Abby, but that applies to all three papers. I'm really struck by the idea that our experience of bitterness is it may be intercepting a communication that has absolutely nothing to do with us whatsoever. And I guess I'd like all three of you to ponder that thought. Like, what does it mean that, we are all of us making meaning with plants, and the meaning that they might be making with us might have nothing to do with us whatsoever. So sort of thinking about queer ecology in that sort of larger ecological sense. So I guess we'll start with Abby.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely started thinking about bitterness as they must be talking to us. They must be telling us something. But I think there's kind of two pieces to that. It could be we're just interrupting a conversation that, again, is none of our business. Or it could also be like a multi-species communication. Like there's also the possibility that whether like bitterness might not be telling us, don't eat me, don't eat me, don't eat me, I'll kill you. But it could be a toned down version of that for larger plant eaters. And so, yeah, I find a lot of delight in the idea that it's the possibility of that as a communication. And same with sweetness. Sweetness is eat me, eat me, eat me, and poop me out later and spread my seeds somewhere. Like that's also a communication. But yeah, there's some kind of something really special about it expanding beyond our brains and being interpreted by so many other beings we share the world with.
I guess maybe thinking similarly to bitterness in the sense that it's not for us. I've been doing a lot of research recently around the phenomenon of iridescence and how it shows up in plants and animals as a survival adaptation mechanism. And depending on the species, it can be a camouflage tactic, or it can be a warning tactic, or it can be a mating tactic. And I think like iridescence as like a quality is something that like we as humans are like extremely attracted to and very curious by, but ultimately it's something that's not for us. And so I don't know if I have maybe an answer, but it's something that maybe I'm thinking through in a slightly different way right now.
It's such a good question. I mean, in terms of, yeah, there's a question of like, what is the communications that we have? What are the expectations? Also, there's historical baggage around how we perceive other species communicating as well, or even ourselves. I mean, let's not beat around that bush. But I think like one of the things I found, and this isn't necessarily directly about the pansies, but my own material work where I'm performing in some of these garments or, you know, in the thickets doing crayon rubbings or other aspects of that work, that there's a lot of irritation that happens between myself and the other species that are inhabiting those environments. So, for example, when I was in that giant black, you know, cloak dancing around on the beach, I was actually getting attacked by red ants at the same time. So I was covered in bites by the end of the day. But that also kind of queers a relationship with, you know, the expectation of what that performance would be, or my experience of like, oh, you know, I'm so magnificent in this thing, and that's such a great experience with like, I'm actually like have to go inside and cover myself with calamine lotion immediately after I finish this. So I think there is an interaction with, even though some of those can be pleasurable too, like thinking about the history of like ertification and like hitting yourself with stinging nettles. Like there's a medicine in that. I don't know where I'm going with this, but being like scratched up, like there's a satisfaction to being in the thick of it at the same time that it's maybe that experience is not the experience of what you're trampling through, even if you're doing it carefully. Like, you know, the red ants being like, get the fuck out of our home, you know, or not, yeah. Or maybe they're inviting me to join them and stay, yeah.
Besides are an invitation.
Yeah.
Well, I'm actually going to stop us now. We're having a productive pause before the second panel, but a big round of applause to Abby, Haley, and Morris. Thank you all so much. So great. And we will be back here with the second panel starting at 2:45. So there's coffee, there is so much snacks. Please avail yourselves, and we'll see you in a few short minutes.
We'll be back very soon. Okay, bye.